good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Kohl from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and it's my pleasure to present a paper with you, to you that I've written with Stephen Brackman and Harry Gerritsen. They're also based in Groningen. And so we're going to move now from the questions that were asked at the beginning of this workshop, which were really thought-provoking questions, and now I'm going to take you to some hardcore econometrics. Okay, so anyway, I'll try to be gentle and to take you through it step by step. But so what motivated this question was basically saying that so in the traditional trade literature, econometric trade literature, we use the gravity equation to see whether the presence of a trade agreement increases, decreases, or doesn't have any effect on international trade flows. And so what's been done in the literature so far is just to say that trade agreements, if they are present between countries, you indicate that with a 1 and otherwise a 0 if they're lacking. So you just use a simple dummy variable and you don't actually account for differences between trade agreements. Well, I don't have to convince anyone here today that there are substantial differences in the design of these trade agreements. But empirical studies have been slow to actually incorporate this truth into, well, our analyses. So this is the background that motivates this paper. And so, well, a little bit more background is, well, we've already touched on the Doha round lasting forever and ever. And Andy Rose, of course, wrote his famous paper in 2004 already saying that, listen, the WTO is practically dead or useless to increase trade. And Richard Baldwin has been among several other authors proposing the idea that regionalism has taken off, especially in the 1990s, actually, as a sort of a substitute for the WTO. Now, when it comes to, okay, so this is just the background. Is it the WTO that's trade promoting, or is it more regionalism that's taking over this task in the 21st century? Is there still a role for the WTO, yes or no? So that's sort of the background, and we actually come back to this question towards the end of our paper. Now, when it comes to the econometrics, the famous strategy is this dummy approach that I've told you about. Frankel has a big book and famous papers that he wrote to sort of summarize the literature. Very good reference for that. Bayer and Bergstrand have written several papers with the gravity equation in which they always use these dummy variables. And so, just taking these papers as a starting point, we say let's look at other papers that try to look at the content of these trade agreements, in which trade agreements are not treated as a black box, where you just throw everything in and see what comes out, but here we're actually going to look at the detailed contents of the different provisions. So there is actually a surprisingly large literature that looks at sector-specific contents of trade agreements and how they impact trade. So you can find a couple of papers out there that look at environmental provisions in trade agreements. INMA has a paper on that. There's a lot out there on investment provisions and the effect on trade and FDI. Services are also a hot topic in the literature, but papers that look at more encompassing measures that look at let's say the larger anatomy of these trade agreements, they're relatively scarce. Freudis and Sapir wrote a paper that was published in the World Economy in 2010, in which they basically compared the anatomy of all the EU's and US's trade agreements. And what they find there is that there's substantial variation in how the EU goes about designing its trade agreements and how the US goes about this. And they actually develop a methodology that I'm going to use as well in this paper, and extend it to even more FTA trade agreements than those that are listed here. Building on the same methodology, Orfici and Rocha presented a database with 96 trade agreements. They did this for the World Trade Organization when they worked there. And then they looked at the effect of these trade agreements on production networks trade. Now, the contribution of this paper is to take this methodology even further and to present a public database that's available online that gives you all the guts and gore of these different trade agreements. We do this for 17 different policy domains that are frequently contained in 296 trade agreements. And we also construct several indices that try to capture the, let's say, the comprehensiveness of these trade agreements. Okay, so instead of just having a dummy that's 0 or 1, we create a continuous variable that ranges from 0 to 1 and everything in between to give you a better, that's more sensitive to the content of these trade agreements. We also look at whether provisions are just covered or whether they're actually legally enforceable. So we're actually forced to read these provisions one by one to get a better sense of what they actually, whether it's just soft or whether they are actually provisions that have teeth. Now, after we've constructed this database, we then apply to the gravity equation, basically to address for this issue of measurement error that we see in this dummy variable. And then we find actually that there are quite a lot of WTO externalities that work through these trade agreements. But before we get to the empirical part, let me just show you how the database itself is constructed. So how did I do this? Well, I relied on basically two main sources, if I may aggregate them like that. The first source is the World Bank's Global Preferential Trade Agreements database, which is keyword searchable for about 300 trade agreements, and they keep on adding new agreements as much as possible. So that's the one source, but you cannot fully rely just on this source. You need to also have the actual PDFs of the full agreement texts with you so that you can double check that their coding is consistent. So what you find here is, for instance, that if you were to type in it's like a Google of trade agreements. So if you were to type in labor standards, you'll see the provisions per agreement and whether they are at all present in a trade agreement or not. But you need to double check this because their coding algorithm doesn't always work the way you'd like it to. And then I follow my predecessors by differentiating between WTO plus and WTO X policy areas. Now, the literature is ambivalent as to what is what. So in this paper, we say that WTO plus provisions are those provisions that are already within the WTO's mandate. Okay, so they're already contained in WTO agreements, whereas WTO-X provisions are relatively new, more modern kind of trade provisions that are not within the mandate of the WTO. So you won't find them in WTO agreements at the moment. We also distinguish between legal coverage and legal enforceability. How we distinguish between these two, I will explain next. So here are just some examples. So I'm not a lawyer, okay? I'm just building on the methodology introduced by other trade lawyers, and I follow their footsteps. So one example here is of a provision that is covered, that shows that the policy area is covered, but it's not legally enforceable. Each party shall endeavor to improve its intellectual property protection system, or each party shall cooperate to try and liberalize this in the future. Or words such as cooperation, consider, negotiate, these are all verbs that suggest that there is some effort being made, but suppose that they don't come to a full-fledged commitment, then you can't sue the other party for negligence or not sticking to its promises. It's also clear, of course, that provision is not legally enforceable when it's explicitly excluded from dispute settlement. And you often see these kind of provisions saying that articles shall not be subject to the dispute settlement provisions of this agreement. Okay, so these are two big flags that we look at to get a sense of whether a commitment is hard or soft. More convincing language is here, for instance, where you see, as of the entry into force of this agreement, both parties shall grant each other's companies free access to whatever market or whatever kind of economic area, or members must eliminate non-tariff barriers on a gradual basis within a period of 5 or 10 years after entry force of this agreement. Okay, so these are very common kind of provisions that you see in all sorts of trade agreements, but these clearly show that must or shall, these are strong verbs that have a strong legal context as well. So they signal that there is legal enforceability. And timing is also really very important here. So you're not just saying that sometime in the future we will consider talking about this, but no, we've talked about this and we've come to an agreement that within 5 or 10 years it will be liberalized, or action must have been taken. Okay, So just to give you an idea of the heterogeneity in this database, the blue bars represent trade agreements with a provision that is covered. So coverage is, of course, always at least the same size as agreements that are, the number of agreements with provisions that are legally enforceable. Red is legally enforceable. What you see here on the right-hand side are the provisions, is the number of agreements with provisions that are legally enforceable. Well, for import restrictions and export restrictions, most trade agreements will contain some language on this, so this is not very surprising. Anti-dumping, countervailing measures, also very popular, very common in most of the agreements, in more than 2/3. Customs administration, more than 2/3 of the agreements. But then we get to intellectual property rights. That's over here. Well, okay, so slightly more coverage than legal enforceability. Same can be said for state aid and agriculture. But now it starts getting really interesting and juicy, where you see that when we talk about technical barriers to trade, sanitary measures, public procurement, services, state trading enterprises, and investment clauses, there are much larger differences. Not only in terms of whether these agreements talk at all about these policy areas, but also especially in terms of whether they're actually legally enforceable. Okay, so you see some large gaps here that, for instance, 150 of these agreements do have some language on investment provisions, but about half of those provisions are actually legally enforceable. That was, by the way, for the WTO plus provisions, so these provisions are already within the WTO's mandate. Turning to the WTO X provisions, here we see that capital mobility and competition laws tend to be dominant in about 2/3 of the sample, and that when there is language on these provisions, it's also relatively hard, so these are legally enforceable. But for labor and environment, you see that these issues are very scarce, actually, in these agreements. But surprisingly, when there are commitments, they also tend to be legally enforceable.
Can you be a bit more clear what exactly the numbers add up to? So this 50.
So 50 out of 296 agreements have a provision that on labor.
Just one.
50 out of 296.
So you mean, like, for example, if within the same document there are 5?
No, this is there are 296 trade agreements in total. 50 out of 296 trade agreements contain a provision.
Okay.
Thank you for the question. Okay, and now for the data freaks. This is the data set. You can download it from my website. And so in this database, well, the picture I'd like you to focus on is just this part, where you see that, yes, there is substantial heterogeneity. The black boxes show you the provisions that are legally enforceable. The gray boxes show you the provisions that are covered but that are not legally enforceable, and white means there's nothing in the agreement for this policy area. Now here you can find data on the provision, on the agreement, when it was enforced, and then we construct a lot of different indices to try and capture the heterogeneity, to give it a number that you can use in the gravity equation. Interestingly, I did not include this picture, but I think it builds nicely on the discussion we had previously. If you look at these pictures for EU agreements, you'll see a lot of, well, most of it will be filled, but a lot of it will be gray. Okay, so the EU wants to talk about everything, but not everything is legally enforceable. When you look at the picture for US agreements, you'll see relatively, well, there will be perhaps not as many provisions covered, but most of them will be black. So when the US commits to something, they also make credible commitments. And when you look at ASEAN agreements, you'll see very few provisions being covered at all. Okay. Now, how do we construct these indices that we use for the gravity equation? So this is now where we turn to the application part. Now, it must be said that there is no clear theory that tells us exactly how to construct this ultimate measure on how we capture trade agreement comprehensiveness. So we have a couple of ideas that we use here, and in our empirical estimations, it turns out that it doesn't really matter exactly whether you weigh them or not. the basic message is the same. So what we do basically is say that we construct a measure, an index for WTO plus provisions. So there are 13 WTO plus provisions in total, and we just look at the number of trade agreements with WTO plus provisions that are covered. Okay, and then we divide that by 13, and then we have our index per agreement. We can do the same for WTO provisions. So there are 4 provisions in total per agreement that can be covered. Say 2 of them are covered, then the index for that agreement becomes 2 divided by 4 is half. We can then construct an overall measure in which we make a distinction between WTO plus and WTO X provisions. Sorry, this should be an X, where you say it's 50-50, or you could just say we ignore the differences and just weigh all of these provisions equally. Okay, as I said again, how you exactly weigh these different provisions doesn't seem to really matter. We've tried with a lot of different simulations, and the overall results remain the same. Now for our gravity equation, is everyone who's heard of the gravity equation before? Can I just see some hands, please? Okay, so I'll explain a little bit more here. So we have data on 181 countries for 1948 to 2011, and we just look at the trade effects for 296 trade agreements. We of course know that there are more trade agreements out there, and in order to avoid measurement bias, we just drop the countries for which we don't have detailed data on the trade agreements. Then we estimate a structural gravity equation. And what it does is you take the log of bilateral imports in a given year between 2 countries, and you explain that by the GDP of both the importer and the exporter, the bilateral distance between the 2 of them, the index of the trade agreement, so 0 to 1. Then we include a range of fixed effects that are country, time, and diet specific. We basically follow Bayer and Bergster in 2007 in this approach. The nice thing about this is that we eliminate all concerns about endogeneity bias. So whether a trade agreement causes more trade, or whether you have more trade because of whether you have a lot of trade and therefore you sign a trade agreement, you cancel all of this out by using these fixed effects. And so what we do is basically now introduce a horse race between all our different ways to measure trade agreement heterogeneity. Over here, this first number is just the dummy, right? The 0 or 1 dummy. And we find that it's really consistent with what we see in the literature that follows this dummy approach, with this being the coefficient. Then we turn to, okay, what happens if we just take our overall measure of trade agreement comprehensiveness, 0 to 1, right? So for trade agreements, if they're covered, just looking at coverage, we see that the estimate is already higher, suggesting that the more provisions are covered in an agreement, the bigger the effect will be on trade flows. But we also see that it does matter to correct somewhat for enforceability. So when we only look for provisions that are actually legally covered, we see that there is a smaller effect on trade. Now we can also measure this in a different way. That's what this very mini asterisk suggests. These are just our different ways to measure it. But as you see, the parameter estimates are very, very similar. But now the question arises, what actually happens when we say that we care about the distinction between WTO plus and WTO X provisions? Okay? Because so far we've just lumped them all together. What if we break this down? Well, we see that it now really matters whether you also distinguish between coverage and legal enforceability. Suppose we just look at the number of provisions covered in an agreement without looking at whether they're actually legally enforceable. Okay, so we look at everything that's written on paper. Then we see that the existing WTO plus provisions have some effect on trade, but that these newer measures are actually most important to stimulate trade. Right? So labor, environment, capital mobility, competition, these are found here to have the strongest effect on trade. But does this really make sense? I don't think so, because they don't really cover things that have to do with trade, right? What about import and export restrictions? You'd expect that, as an economist, that these have much stronger effects. So then we turn to looking at enforceability, and we see exactly the opposite result. The fact that all of the trade effects come from WTO plus provisions, and none of these effects actually come from WTO X provisions. That's a signal that I'm out of time. So I'll quickly, Chair, how much time do I have extra?
10 more minutes.
10 more, okay.
Mel, to finish.
The chair is, okay, I will be brief. So with the first differences, you can actually do a similar story. The basic reason why you want to do this is to say, we know that trade agreements are phased in over time. Okay, we have to allow them some time to come to their full effect. And the nice thing is that with first differences, you can include these lags and leads much quicker. So a lead saying that we can also expect that there is some phase-in effect, an anticipation effect, so that before an agreement is actually enforced, you can expect trade to start increasing between countries with an agreement. Now in this table, basically, we again have the similar horse race, and look especially at these two coefficients, these two rows, where you see that just with a standard dummy, trade doesn't seem to really increase over a 10-year period. But as soon as we start distinguishing for the extensiveness of these commitments, we basically see phase-in effects. Okay, so this is within the first 5 years, this is in the second 5-year period. Okay, so far so good. It suggests that there are indeed phase-in effects. But once we again distinguish between WTO plus and WTO X provisions, we again see a very similar story to the one I described previously, namely that most of the story actually comes from, well, all of the story comes from these WTO plus provisions, but not from WTO X provisions. So this whole idea that you hear, this is a side note, from policymakers saying that we have to present a full menu of options that we have to talk about to stimulate trade, these empirical findings suggest a somewhat different story. Finally, what is the role of the WTO? So here we look at trade agreements in which the members of the trade agreements are also, and the extent to which those members are also involved in the WTO. The idea being that suppose that we have a trade agreement introduced by countries that are also WTO members, that they will simply copy and paste provisions from the WTO into their new trade agreements. And we indeed find that that is the case. Controlling for both the index that I've constructed here and the extent to which countries are, all countries are also in the WTO, that's all in WTO. Or maybe just one of the countries in the agreement is also in the WTO. In that case, it's mixed membership. Okay, so some trade agreement partners are outside the WTO. At least one of them is a WTO member. In that case, what we actually see is that even if just one of the trade agreement countries is also in the WTO, you already see that trade agreements have a significant impact on trade. So what this suggests is that as soon as just one country is part of the WTO, there seems to be a spillover effect in terms of policy, so which trickles down or trickles over to other countries that are not part of the WTO. Perhaps as a lawyer, this is not surprising because you want to ensure that your legal frameworks are consistent. But what these results pick up, but this is the idea that these results pick up on. Okay, so wrapping up, we open the black box of trade agreements by looking at the contents of 296 trade agreements in detail. All of these details are online in a publicly available database. And we use the information from this database to address measurement bias in the gravity equation. And we find that more comprehensive trade agreements have stronger effects on trade than agreements that are weaker. And this is consistent with other kinds of approaches that we've taken in recent new papers to distinguish between different types of agreements based on their design. And with that, thanks very much for your attention. I believe we have to bring the chair.
Agreements in gravity models, and this is a very comprehensive study, so congratulations for that. And I just have a couple of comments on the methodology. maybe one is a clarificatory one. Did you use PPML, pseudo also maximum likelihood method?
In a previous version of the paper, we did use PPML.
And in this version, what do you use? What's the estimation method?
Okay, so in our previous version, we used PPML and basically used the same setup. So by just going through the trade agreement dummy 0, 1, then we started using different forms of the indices, and basically the results are pretty much consistent with what we see with our structural gravity equation with OLS. So whether we account for these zero trade flows or not doesn't really make a difference for our findings.
Okay, and the second comment I have is, so this is not specific to your paper, but in general in gravity studies, we usually have the dummies or the variables that capture these policy changes. They are contemporaneous, right? You don't have lagged effects there. And usually, you would expect the free trade agreements to start affecting trade maybe after a year or two. Particularly, some of the things that you mentioned about less tangible or not legally enforceable provisions, they're going to take some time to actually affect trade.
Yeah.
Because they are more like providing signals. So I would probably think about including lags of some of these variables. Probably, I think this paper probably you don't need that to do this, but maybe that's something we can explore in a different paper, where you can think about the lags. So what is the adjustment period, or what is the time period it takes to affect trade?
Yeah.
That's the point I have, and I have one last point, and that's about this unobserved heterogeneity in panel data. And there is some recent literature talking about the interaction between time and cross section, where we have this interactive fixed effects, and there was one application specific to gravity models by Serlanga and Shin. Maybe you are aware of this. It was in 2007 in Journal of Applied Econometrics. Probably that literature could be applied here in the future, where you can talk about, because you're talking about a lot of heterogeneity here, and some of it can be specific to time. So it's good to control for those effects. So I think that's pretty much I have so far. We have some more comments I can probably communicate over email.
Okay, thanks very much for your comments. I'll respond first to these. So the first question we've talked about PPML to account for zero trade flows. The second issue with lags, so allowing for the phase-in effects. So we try to capture these lags by using first differences. So basically a strategy that Bayer and Bergstrand used in their 2007 paper. So doing that suggests that there are indeed phase-in effects over a long period of time. But interestingly, we find that when we really distinguish between the WTOX and WTO plus provisions, that most of it actually happens just within a 5-year period. I'm currently working on another paper with Tibor Basidis and James Lake, in which we're looking at how long it takes if you use tariff schedules to phase in trade. And there we see as well that most of it actually happens within a 5-year time period and not 10 years, but those results are still very preliminary. What I will do is also just to include these lags in my basic gravity setup without looking also at first differences and see whether those results are consistent. So that will definitely help to be a robustness check. When it comes to the unobserved heterogeneity of time, I must admit I'm not familiar with the paper that you mentioned, but I think that if my understanding of your question is correct, the idea is that time has some effect in every year on trade, and you'd want to capture that. So traditionally in the gravity equation, you do this with just a time-fixed effect, a dummy per year. What we do here is to say that this time dummy needs to be interacted with the importer, but also with the exporter. So this is basically an idea to account for multilateral resistance terms based on Anderson and Van Wynkoop, to account for the fact that prices change for both the importer but also the exporter every single year. But I will look at this. So I think that we do deal with this issue of unobserved heterogeneity over time. But I will also look at this reference that you've given to see if there's something that we could add to strengthen the paper.
Yeah, sure. I think what you have done is sufficient for these purposes.
Okay.
And that's exactly what I was talking about. Not just time fixed effects, but how time interacts with heterogeneity.
Yeah. Okay.
But this is a bit more rigorous, so we can look at that. And even this study that I mentioned, Sedlak and Shin, was specific to gravity.
Mm-hmm.
It was in Journal of Applied Econometrics. But later on, there were even better methodologies for this issue in general, not specific to gravity. By Dushan Bai in 2009 in Econometrica. So yeah, we can probably communicate bilaterally on this. So any other questions or comments?
I saw that you said that you have accounted for the clustering between the exporter and the importer.
Mm-hmm.
Did you account for the clustering for regional agreements? So, for example, in EU, in the case that I've done,
Mm-hmm.
There was a sequence for the EMFTA, for the free trade agreement between Europe and the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
There was a sequence of agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And I would guess that there would be some commonality amongst them.
Yeah.
So I would guess that maybe another robustness check, so to speak, or I don't believe that it would change too much your your results, but it would be a good idea to get this clustering for each cluster of agreements.
Yeah.
Maybe it would go over some period of time, of course.
Yeah. It's a wonderful idea. In fact, also just to think about the paper when you think about the design and evolution of trade agreements, right? So and how trade agreements are negotiated in terms of packages, right? So we have all these different provisions. 17 here, you could extend that even more. But then to say, so the EU's approach is to say everything is on the table and everything must be dealt with, whereas the Asian approach is much more minimalistic, but there are some essential issues that need to be covered at least, right? So it would be interesting. There is already a literature on this. So what do you include? What don't you include? But I think that there's much more of an interesting story that we can tell there. How to deal with this in this particular paper, I'm not so sure, because I think that the index is constructed at an agreement level, and we also control for our standard errors are clustered at the dyadic level, at the country pair level. So I think that we already account for some of the clustering ideas there. But definitely,
And also there's a time sequence.
Yeah.
In that one, so it's not only the intra-country.
No.
It's also the time element.
Yes.
I say that I don't believe that it would bias too much your results, but it would be a very interesting, as you said, story to tell.
Absolutely.
In relation to this, I think an idea to explore could be an estimator that has been proposed by Manresa, Bonomé and Manresa, forthcoming in Econometrica 2015, and they use what they call group fixed estimator, or mean group estimator. I have to check, but anyway, it's Bonomé and Manresa, and what they do is they include time effects that are common for groups of countries. But the groups are endogenously estimated. So I think
Yeah.
this could be, I don't know, something to explore.
Okay, thanks. I'll have to check that.
This is somehow related, I think, with my question, because my concern is where do trade agreements come from? Where are they going? Because we probably need to model that as a kind of first stage type of approach to weed out the possible endogeneity effects. I'm also concerned a bit about the fact that you get a 92.8% R squared, which betrays a bit of endogeneity somewhere. Obviously, you got exports, imports, and income. So wouldn't it be, because your paper is about identifying the effects of the trade agreements, wouldn't it make sense to normalize the left-hand side with income and regress this against the variables of concern, just ideally with some of treatment effects approach, which won't reach
Yeah.
must be.
Yeah.
We find plenty of those.
Yeah.
The other thing, sorry, is that you might want to consider interaction between the two. You might want to consider the fact that in some cases the X element is not there at all. The other thing that I'm thinking of is the trade agreement. How long does it last? You put a trade agreement in '97, and then probably superseded by another one. How do you treat that? Do you drop it out of the estimation, or do you keep it? So you some of these might be. Some of these agreements may be superseding previous ones, and we probably need to be aware of that effect.
Yeah. So, two comments on that particular aspect. In the agreements that I've looked at, you actually don't see too much replacement going on, but rather that they do tend to stick around forever. But there are exceptions. The other thing is that the measure is constructed based on just looking at the contents of the agreement as when it was enforced. But all additional addendums, modifications that may have happened later on were not included. And so, well, of course, this is a nightmare to investigate for all these agreements, but that would be something to make it more time varying variable. That would be a second step. And I think a useful step as well, because you do see that there are modifications of